everybody. Thanks for coming to participate in the discussion. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about foods we've eaten and how it's developed over time and why we eat what we eat. And what we're expected to eat right now and whether or not it's possible to actually have a healthy diet like this. We're all trying to decide whether or not she's going to eat a salad or have some sweets. So for my talk, I'd like to talk about a little bit about the history of the human diet. Then I want to talk about what are we expected to eat and how it's changed over time. And I'd also like to talk about some of the dieting options. And I want to get into whether or not it's possible to actually have a healthy diet and what are the ways to do it. And then I want to talk about, I'm not going to go too much into the science behind it, but I want to talk about what are some problems with the food sources that we have today and how things can change. And then I want to talk about overall awareness as to the food that we're putting in our bodies. So first, I'd like to go back into ancient times with cavemen, and just to give you an idea of what it's like, these people back in the day were fighting for every bite that they were eating, and they had to know that everything that they were eating was going to help them survive on a daily basis. And from moment to moment, they didn't know whether or not they were going to be alive the next day, so everything was in the present. So all the food that they had was very precious to them, and it's not so much how it is the way it is today. So everybody recognizes the Geico caveman. And back in the day, one thing that is completely different from what it is today is that their food was 100% unprocessed. So you could go to the supermarket today and buy a bag of chips. You don't even want to know what's in the bag of chips, but back in the day, they had fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. Anything that they killed was 100% unprocessed, fresh meat. In addition, they didn't have pesticides or hormones. And we see every day, if you drive by some kind of farm, you'll see them out spraying. Or you'll see chickens being shot up with antibiotics and whatnot. And one thing that they also didn't have was farming back in the day. So they'd actually go and be hunters and gatherers. So they'd go out into the forest, eat berries, they dig up roots, eat the roots that they could find. Anything they could find to eat was fair game for them. And one thing I'd like to point out is that they didn't have greens or anything like that, so there's no farming. So they didn't eat pasta, which is practically a staple of our diet today. And one of the biggest differences between back then and now is that the caveman was active. He was literally on the run for his life all the time. And today we're sitting in a nice air-conditioned, controlled environment watching computers, which would be unimaginable for him. So next I'd like to move on into Egyptian times. I know I'm going to be skipping around to generations, pretty big gaps, but one of the first things that comes with the Egyptian times is there was farming, and that was first seen about 12,000 years ago. So this society had farming, basically a controlled food source that they wouldn't run out as much as a caveman would, which was very important to them. And we also begin to see the domestication of different animals. So they didn't have to run and go hunt down their prey every time they wanted to eat. Some of the animals that they had for domesticated were ducks and geese. But the funny thing was that they would eat them for meat, but they didn't realize the potential of eating the eggs that they produced as well. So everything wasn't completely as advanced as it was, or it is today. And one thing that we start to see develop with the Egyptians is that they start to have the idea of drinking alcohol and making it and having wine and milk. And it was very important to their lifestyle. And a lot of festivals were very important to the Egyptians. And they would have, this would almost unite like the high society people who were upper level and also the poor people. They would all share in revelry basically. They'd drink for days and eat for days. Everybody would have plenty of food. And one thing that we started to develop that we didn't see with the cavemen is that they had ways to preserve their food. So there was ways to salt them, pickle them, and they used almost underground chambers that were cooler in temperature compared to above the ground. And one thing I'd like to point out is there was a big difference between royalty and common man. So the royalty back in the Egyptian days, they would be carried around basically on chairs. And the common man would be still like a caveman running around, fighting for every bite that he was getting. It wasn't as easy to come by a big meal. So next I'd like to get into the Roman days, Julius Caesar. And the staple of their diet were a lot of grains, oils, and of course wine. Everybody, when you think of Roman days, you think grapes, wine, cheese. And one thing that I read about them was that they would really only have one big meal a day. So they'd wake up and they'd have a piece of bread for breakfast and they'd be on their way. And one thing that they had was cheese, but at that time they thought milk was barbaric, so they didn't drink the actual milk that they could have. And the Rome was pretty close to waterways, so seafood was it was very plentiful for them to go eat. And one thing was that if we eat, we're hungry again in 3 hours. So we have multiple relatively big meals throughout the day, but for breakfast they'd have a piece of bread, and then they'd have one large meal throughout the day. That was originally at lunchtime, and then it actually moved to eventually be dinner time. And one of the phrases was that I looked when I was looking at the Romans was, "You are what you eat." And at that time it was the truth, because the people that were high up and powerful, they were able to get exotic food from different places around the world. And the poor man was stuck on eating grains, oils, and basically bread. So next, I'm going to jump to the 1800s, big jump, Abraham Lincoln, just to give you a time perspective. The foods that they ate at the time were pretty much the same as what we eat today, except still we didn't have the processing and the antibiotics and all the junk that is put into food today. And a lot of the people at the time, if you weren't living in a city, you were out in a rural environment, and what you caught that day, what you farmed that day was what you ate for dinner. So hunting was a big deal, and people were very active. So they'd wake up before the sun rises, and then they'd go to sleep when the sun set. So they were out culturing and hunting the food down that they wanted to eat. And one important thing that came during the 1800s, late 1800s, was the implementation of the railroad system. So before, if you lived on a farm, you'd eat everything that you grew or hunted. But now that there was a railroad, goods could be transported all across the country, and you get a taste a little bit about what it's like to live somewhere else, basically. And one thing I'd like to point out at that time was that today we base our diet around 2,000 calories, but back in the day, women were actually expected to eat around 3,000 calories, and men 4,500 calories. And this was because people back then were so much more active. They would easily, throughout the day, burn that many calories, so the intake was a lot higher. So today, this is an example of something that we eat. You wouldn't see this back in the day. And just to give you an example of what I ate over the past few days, I had Monterey's, I've had eggs, lasagna, spilled beans, ice cream. I had Papa's and beer, yogurt, granola, bananas, strawberries, fruits, raspberries, and of course alcohol in moderation. So a lot of these foods that we have today, we couldn't even dream about having back in the day. And I think it's important to point out that back in the day, everything was unprocessed and natural, and this stuff almost doesn't seem like it's natural to eat, but we can get in an argument later. So next I'd like to give you an idea of what the expected food intake is for today, and it's based on a 2,000 calorie diet, and this is from the Mayo Clinic. And I'd like to point out the fat intake and the sodium levels. Those are definitely some of the main issues with today's diet, is that they're way too elevated and higher than what we should actually be eating. So I thought, okay, if we're supposed to eat 2,000 calories a day, what does that mean? Like, what are we supposed to eat? And this is just a sample of what a typical regimen of meals would be throughout the day to accomplish and be within the recommended daily dosages. So you can see with breakfast, you could still have an omelet and all these wonderful foods and fruits, and you could have a snack even. You could even have a lunch, tuna meltdown. You could even fit in frozen yogurt. And then you get to dinner, you can still have your strip steak. And then you can see that the totals eventually go to 2,000 calories, and you're within the recommended daily dosages of everything else. So why is it so hard for people to be within these daily values and have, I guess, some sort of self-control? Why is like obesity such a big deal these days when you can still eat all this good stuff and be healthy? So that's one other thing I want to get into, is the feasibility of eating healthy. And I know it's really hard talking, kind of preaching to the choir, because it's hard for all of us to stop what we're doing and get a healthy meal in. Because I know when I wake up in the morning, I'm not worried about packing a salad for lunch or packing a healthy meal. I just go right across the way to Fernell and get something crappy to eat, basically. So one thing I'd like to point out is that it does take a lot of discipline to do this, so it's more like mind over matter. You have to want to be healthy. And then it also depends on like your weight gain and weight loss goals. And I like to point out weight gain as well, not just weight loss, because if you want to be more healthy, you might need to gain some weight. And then also convenience factors. So like I mentioned, it's so easy to go to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger for $1 rather than go and make healthy food on your own. And another thing I'd like to point out is it might be really easy to eat this nice bag of vegetables, but what you don't know is that the sodium content in vegetables is half the daily value of what you're supposed to eat. So you have to be really mindful of the labels that you're reading. And today, commercial companies don't care about whether or not it's healthy or not. They want you to buy it. So if there actually is an unhealthy amount of like sodium or salt in the product, they're not going to advertise it on there. They're going to make it seem like there's not that much. So one quote that I found is actually pretty inspiring. Discipline is doing what you don't want to do when you don't want to do it. So when you have the choice of eating a cheeseburger, you don't really want to give up that cheeseburger, but down the road, it's probably more important than you do. So one thing that when I was looking up all this stuff, I was thinking about all the different dieting types that you have. So there's people that don't eat meat, there's people that don't eat fish, there's people that only eat vegetables and whatnot. So I was wondering about what are the different classifications. So what does it mean to be carnivore, omnivore, pescatarian, only vegetarian? Like I didn't know the difference between what a vegetarian and a vegan was. And apparently it turns out that the vegan will not eat eggs and dairy, whereas a vegetarian will. And I'd also like to point out that the different religious aspects as well, and what they eat and choose not to eat. And then to give you an idea of what the caveman diet was, it's kind of becoming popular again today. People who are really into working out, they'll go ahead and eat their vegetables and meats, but they won't eat dairy, and they won't consume alcohol. So basically things that weren't available at the time. So it's just giving you an idea of what other people think about what they want to eat. So next I want to dip in a little bit to the food sources that are available to us today. So it might just look like a white blanket basically, but those are actually all chickens in a chicken coop. And I was reading about it last night and it was like becoming more and more of a problem to me because I eat a lot of chicken and it kind of made me sick to see all this stuff. And just to throw a few stats out, 9 billion chickens a year in the United States, that's 9 billion in the United States alone, are used for the meat, and 235 million chickens are used for their eggs. And they're pumped full of antibiotics, their living conditions are really awful, and the way that they live is there's a lot of disease. Some of the diseased chickens, they'll die and they won't be able to find them because there's so many chickens. And for lack of a better term, where they are, they shit on each other and they eat it as well. And chickens have also been known to become very aggressive in these conditions that they're held into. So they fight each other, peck each other, and kill each other and eventually eat each other. So you might not necessarily be signing up for what you get when you eat it. And the next I want to point out are farming these days. And one thing a term that gets thrown around a lot is what's organic. A lot of people think, oh, it's organic, I'm eating good. And I actually looked up what organic means, and it technically doesn't mean that farmers aren't using pesticides and sprays when they're treating their vegetables and crops. What it actually means is that the pesticides or powders and sprays that they're using are made from natural materials, so something that's not synthetic. And they did a study where they tested the carcinogenic effects of the synthetic pesticides and they found them to be carcinogenic. And they also did the same thing with the natural materials that they thought would be safe for people, but in those same dosages are actually carcinogenic as well. So next time you go to the supermarket, just because it says organic, don't think that you might not be at risk. So one thing that you could do to help address this issue and about eating healthy is raising awareness. And the first is disease. And everybody knows about atherosclerosis, diabetes, and obesity, the crisis that we really do have today. And a stat that I found too was that by 2016, they're predicting that 41% of people over the age of 18 are actually going to be obese. And that's going to be a problem for everybody in the healthcare industry years down the road. And one thing is being active. A lot of us sit at a desk all day or sit in the lab all day, but it's important to get your exercise in. And also be mindful of the preparation that goes into making the foods that you eat. So if you have vegetables, make sure you don't get the sauce that comes on it or whatever. And one thing that might be helpful is to keep track of what you actually eat, because I did that over the past week and it's not very easy to the mind. You kind of think about it, feel bad about it. So then one thing I will leave you guys with is everybody knows there's a McDonald's Big Mac, and can you guess the amount of fat and calories and cholesterol and sodium that goes into making it? If anybody has any idea, but any guesses?
1,000 calories. Isn't it over 5,000 calories?
No, it's not 5,000. It's lower than that.
1,200. You're including the fries? 1,000.
No, I'm including fries.
I used to know.
Here's actually the fat. So you can see it's 600 calories. Look at the fat. So you're actually getting more than half the fat content you should be getting in a single day in a single burger. And this doesn't even include the fries you're going to eat or the large soda you're going to get.
It's got vitamin C though.
Yeah. So one thing I'd also like to point out is the amount of sodium that's in it as well. So it does have protein though, so you do get something good out of it. But yeah, so it's one thing to think about when you're going into a fast food place. If you have the choice of going and taking home cooked meal versus going to get McDonald's. I did read that there is a group of companies out there that are particularly interested in banding together to make a pact to reduce the amount of sodium in the product by 20% over the next 5 years. So hopefully see that. And this is a little joke kind of that I found on the internet. It says, "You're eating pizza again." Yeah, I know, I can't help it. But today I'm only going to have 2 slices. So then he proceeds to just cut the whole entire pizza into 2 pieces and eat it. So thank you very much for your time.